Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Bycer, and for today, we're going to do something a little bit differently. My guest is currently doing the PAX Onlne show, and I have a chance to talk with him virtually about his upcoming game. And that is, of course, 30XX, the action roguelike based on Megaman X design and the follow up to 20XX. So please welcome for this chat from Batterystaple Games, Chris. How are you doing?
Hey, just fine. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Chris from Battery Staple. I'm a creative director on 30XX.
Yeah, great, and thank you again for taking some time out from the show. I hope things aren't too busy for you out there or doing things digitally now.
No, there's just the right amount of busy. We're used to we're used to physical shows being these, really intense, high energy, invigorating events where we take 4 or 5 of our days and just we're nose to the grindstone the entire time. So even though it's been a very busy week for us here, it still doesn't compare to the amount of effort we put into a physical show. So we're comfortable.
All right, great. And for those of you listening, we are kind of like on time here, so those will be kind of a shorter cast for my regulars. But as I already told Chris, if you are free in the future for something a little bit more lengthy, we have some massive discussion sometimes on our design casts on Game
Sure,
Wisdom.
yeah, we'd love to do that.
All right, so to get things started, I guess very quickly, for people listening to us who aren't familiar, could you talk a little bit about your background and what is, I guess, 30XX?
Sure. So I'll start with 30XX. The quick way to describe 30XX is it's kind of like co-op roguelike Megaman X. So it's got that classic action platformer feel and crisp gameplay that you're looking for from that kind of old school action platformer. But it's procedurally generated, so it's going to be a different experience every time you play it. Unique situations, unique events every time, different powers, weapons, bosses, stuff like that every time you go through, and full multiplayer, so you can enjoy it either on the couch or online with up to one friend. In terms of my background, I've been making games for 7 or 8 years now. When we started making the game's predecessor, 20XX, back in the middle of 2013, that was my first attempt at making a commercial game. Prior to that, I'd been out of college for 8 years or so, and worked as a programmer first for a telecom services company, and then as a programmer for a cybersecurity company. And I got to my late 20s, and for the first time in my life, I had money that I could afford to spend on trying to make my own game, and no, spouse or kids that would be really upset if I blew all that money trying to make a game and lost it all. Because as we know, games is a difficult industry to make
Yes.
money in. It's a very spicy place, especially for first timers like me.
All right, great. And what kind of attracted you to making kind of like this action roguelike based on like Mega Man X's design?
Just childhood love, honestly. The Mega Man 1 was one of the first games I played when I was a little boy. I'm 34, so I was born in '86. And it wasn't until Mega Man 2 that I actually, became good enough to actually like play the games, because Mega Man 1 was also kind of hard as balls. I've always kind of loved that really crisply controlling, you press a button, your character responds instantly. Everything does exactly the way you want it to work. That kind of really crisp control is really, really meaningful to me, and I love the high mobility, the player expression in the Mega Man X games. I think they're really well executed, and so I've always kind of wanted more of that. I've always wanted to play more of that as a consumer. And so when the time came around for me to maybe have a shot at doing this 7 years ago, this was before Mega Man 11 was announced, of course, and we actually started work on the project before Mighty Number 9 was announced as well. And so we basically said nobody's making a game like this, so why don't we give it a shot? And we made it a procedurally generated roguelike, kind of for two major reasons. One, part of the motivation for me was that I always wanted to play more of this style of game, and so I thought, what way to get more of it than to make a replayable version of it? And at the same time, we always knew that there was something we'd have to do to kind of differentiate from just, this is a Mega Man X clone. There has something we had to handle
Hmm.
differently from a design perspective, because the alternative was sort of us saying, look, we think that our work is, just as good to be held up against sort of the Capcom lens of the early X games, which, A, seemed kind of arrogant, and B, seemed kind of stupid, because, it was our first time making a game. Like, I'm not going to assume that we're going to make something that high quality right off the break. And so we decided to make it a roguelike.
And with kind of designing 20XX and now 30XX with those roguelike elements to it, I guess, what did you kind of learn about, trying to adhere, roguelike elements to a predominantly action based design?
That's a really good question. One of the things you come up against very quickly is that sort of one of the really hard strengths of the Mega Man X series and the Mega Man games in general. That it's not 100% true across the board, but for the most part, those games have very, very strong static level design. The way that the designers use the various bits and pieces they have available to them to present challenges to the player is usually really, really well constructed in those games. And when building a roguelike version of it, you run up against a problem where it's sort of difficult to guarantee that level of consistency with these replayable, unique situations every time. And to be perfectly honest, I think level design is kind of one of the places our previous work, 20XX, fell a little bit short. I feel very comfortable saying that without throwing anybody under the bus, because the only person I'm throwing under the bus is me, because I did all of that work, and it's not something I'm especially talented at. It's not something I super well enjoyed. So we're really happy to get to say that for 30XX, we have some really, really talented level designers on the team that are kind of helping us sort of reshape the way 30XX's worlds work. And so one of the things we're doing differently this time around, one of the things I think we've learned, is that in 20XX, every level that the game generates for you basically says, "Oh, I'm a Sky Temple level. I'm going to reach into my bag of Sky Temple level pieces, and I'm going to alternate between combat pieces and platforming pieces, and then eventually there's going to be a boss, and ta-da, it's a level. Here you go." And it worked well enough. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't as strong as it could be. And this time around, we've broken all of our stages into sort of sub themes that we call phases, and each phase is kind of a sub bucket with its own sort of set of constraints and identity, so that there's a much more sort of consistent, coherent theme throughout the level, and a much bigger sense of identity for each sort of sub theme or phase as the user plays through it. So an example here is that the Burning Temple theme in 30XX always has a few sort of distinct phases. It's always going to open with a big sort of wide open forest full of lush green decorations that's relatively light on the platforming, sort of introduces the player to the stage, has sort of a lighter cadence to it. Eventually it will lead into what we call the Indiana Jones segment, where a big rollster wheel mini boss is going to chase you through a really narrow corridor. And if the boss is still alive, by the time it gets to his lair, you'll have a mini boss battle against him. And if you manage to blow him up before you get there, then the mini boss gates just never close and you can cruise right through. And then there's always a short rest room for cadence and to give the player a little opportunity to recuperate a little bit. And then there's going to be a really intense platforming section in the inner temple before leading up to the boss. And so every time you play a Burning Temple stage, you're going to see those beats. You're going to see those phases transition from one to the other. But the pieces that populate those phases, the actual chunks themselves, are going to be randomly picked every time. So you're still going to get unique situations. You're still going to get levels you can't quite memorize every time you end up going through the game. And so we realized the big learning for us. So we thought, we're trying to identify what is it about roguelikeness that appeals to the person playing the game. And the core learning for us is that it's really all about unique situations. It's about new ways, new faces for the game to show the player that hasn't had the opportunity to do so before, giving the players new updated toolkits or different toolkits every time they play through, with different challenges in front of them. And so we can sort of refine the way the game designs levels a little bit to achieve some consistency of theme and some sort of internal identity for the stage without actually giving up on those unique situations by breaking the levels into phases and having it generate from there.
Yeah. And like trying to get that level of variance is a very hard aspect of roguelike design, and especially of an action roguelike. As like with 20XX, it got to the point where if I got like the right leg parts, for instance, like double jump or air dashing, I could very easily just like break those levels. Like, who needs to do platforming if I can just double or triple jump up and grab a
Right, we give
platform
you
above
tools that
me?
lets you circumvent quite a bit of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's still true to an extent in 30XX. The level design accounts for this a little bit more by being a little bit less strictly about being able to cross just distances. So in any kind of action platformer, a double jump is obviously always going to be very powerful. But one of the other ways we sort of balance against this in 30XX is our reworked core AUG system. So for fans of the first game, or for those who are not familiar with the first game, core augs are powerful upgrades that take up one of the four slots on your character's body. So their helmet, their chest piece, their arm part, their leg part. And each of them in 20XX, the first game, is kind of slot exclusive. So you can have one boot part, one chest part, et cetera, et cetera. But other than that, there's no cost to using one. So if you find the double jump boots, you can't use any other boots, but you already have a double jump, so you're in pretty good shape there. In 30XX, we've reworked the core system to be, instead of about slots, the cores you're able to equip are about points. So every core you want to equip, instead of having a slot requirement, now has a point requirement associated with it. So you can use the double jump, you can use the air dash, and unlike 20XX, you can actually stack them here. But in doing so, you're going to spend a whole bunch of core points on those mobility upgrades instead of spending them on durability, on offense, on utility upgrades that you could otherwise equip. So you can basically use these powerful upgrades you find, and you can stack mobility upgrades in ways that weren't possible the first time around. But all of that's going to come at a cost, and by doing that, you're usually going to be giving up something else.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other aspects of 20XX was kind of the persistent elements of being able to upgrade your character beforehand, improving health, a greater chance of finding resources in the future runs, etc., etc. How are you kind of handling or improving the persistent elements with 30XX?
Great question. So we have the level of permanent upgrades in 20XX is relatively shallow overall, and it was because we kind of wanted to avoid the game kind of feeling a little bit too roguelite-ish. To use an example here, I love Rogue Legacy. I love Rogue Legacy to death. It's one of my favorite games, but it's kind of designed around the permanent upgrades being a very large part of character power. It's based around permanent upgrades being honestly 100% of character power, right? Within a Rogue Legacy run, your character doesn't actually get stronger. It's all about what you spend afterward. In 20XX and 30XX, it's really critical to us that most character growth, most power progression happens in the run itself. And so in 20XX, we had a couple of very limited upgrades that would give you a small amount of extra health, a small amount of extra energy, a friend who would visit you in levels to sort of offer you a few power-ups, stuff like that, but relatively low scope. In 30XX, we're expanding that a little bit, both in terms of the overall power, but what we're really doing differently this time around is 30XX's permanent upgrade system offers players a lot of new ways to interact with game systems and decision making. So instead of being strictly, well, your buster is 3 better now, we're going to give you a bunch of additional choices as you unlock and expand through the permanent progression tree. So a big example of this for us is one of the early upgrades in the tree is called the Salvager Circuit. And when you unlock the Salvager Circuit, every time you come across an AUG, a power-up in the run from there on out, or for every run from here on out, you're going to have the choice of picking up that augment for the actual benefit it confers, or you can salvage that augment for a predetermined other benefit. So you might get some extra health, some extra max energy, you might get nuts, you might get a little extra damage even, you might get core points, which lets you use more of those powerful augments that we described in the sort of the mobility chat earlier. So now every time you come across an item, you're saying, does this item fit my build and my game plan? Does it help me do what I'm trying to do? Or do I need its sort of auxiliary salvage benefit more? Maybe you need a few more nuts to afford a shop item, and so even though this item you could pick up would be really great for you, if it puts you over the edge to buy an item you really want, that might take priority. And so it basically turns every power-up opportunity into a decision all of a sudden. And so a lot of our permanent upgrades sort of lean into that. We expand the ways that the player gets to interact with their knowledge of the game the more they play it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I ran into the same thing with Rogue Legacy myself, and we see that in a lot of roguelike games where the power progression just kind of supersedes the need to actually play the game, because you're just going to keep powering up, and then either the base game will become balanced, or you'll just steamroll through the entire game because of it.
Right. So what we're really talking about here is flavor, right? These are just different flavors of the same kinds of systems, and they appeal to different folks. There's Rogue Legacy is a huge hit for a reason, right? There is a large number of people that really want to sink their teeth into a really deep, expansive progression tree. And the fact that it's sort of a matter of when, not if, you'll be able to finish the game is really appealing to a lot of people. And obviously, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it really comes back to our inspirations and our sort of heritage with 30XX a Mega Man X inspired title that has us kind of leaning in the other direction. We want to make sure that eventually you do need to learn the way the game works, and you really do need to overcome the game's challenges, basically via your own, learning and execution skill and sort of willpower to continue to push at it until you can get it, instead of just letting stats put you over the edge. But again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with systems where, stats eventually push you over the edge. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. It's just not the kind of game we're making.
Mm-hmm. Now, another aspect of trying to keep things varied between each run is, of course, the actual boss fights. Now, you mentioned a few minutes ago about kind of taking a more, kind of like a, not so much a set piece, but these various phase kind of theme to each stage. Right. Are you doing anything different with the boss fights in terms of either design, reward structure, or both?
That's a really good question. So right now, and I'll preface this by saying that with 30XX this time around, there are a lot of systems that we're kind of putting into the game, and features and ways to enjoy the game that are kind of brand new to us. And so we're still in pre-alpha really with the game. We'll be entering alpha when we enter early access sometime early next year. We haven't really nailed down the exact date yet. And so a lot of what I'm about to tell you about sort of our boss designs is super subject to change, because we know kind of what our current trajectory is, but we also know that we're going to know sort of exactly how our plans are playing out once we kind of have them in front of a live studio audience. Our community with both 20XX and we hope 30XX is such an essential part of our design process. So as designers, we're not the type of folks who can sort of walk into a padded white room with nothing and walk out with a magnum opus without anybody's feedback. We're much better at building a fun, playable skeleton of a thing and saying, here's where we are. This is what we think is pretty cool. But it'd be really great if you guys sort of gave us the fire hose of feedback and really help us make this thing great. But to your question, we're not really planning on shaking up boss reward structure too much at this time. Pretty similar. You finish a level, you get a new power. Unlike 20XX, both characters can make full use of all of the powers, which we can talk about in just a second, unlike the first game where you kind of have 3 bound to the controller at any given point in time. Mm-hmm. But from a design perspective, we're sort of... when we design a boss, we look for, because the game's a roguelike at heart, we expect you to play through all the levels in one go. We don't expect any of the individual stage bosses to be like, big brick walls all by themselves. But we're looking for a lot of the same things that we did in a 20XX boss. Modularity based on when you fight it in the game in terms of moveset and aggressiveness. We look for specific to 30XX, and this is, boss learning has been a thing that we've worked on a lot since the first game. But we look for the two sort of big hallmarks there are sort of diversity of approach. So make sure each boss has kind of a unique feel to it. The player interacts with the fight in some kind of unique way. And player agency during the battle. So that's kind of a focus on 2 things. One, making sure that the player always has something to be doing during a boss fight. So try and avoid periods of like prolonged waiting or invulnerability or stuff like that. And if you're going to introduce those mechanics, give the player something they can potentially do to either benefit their position during that phase, making subsequent phases easier, or even shortcut the invulnerability phase in question. And 2, always give players some kind of choice of how they approach part of the fight. So an example of this is our clock zone boss, Lethal Tempo, is 4 gear faces in a vertical column that sort of rotate through sets of attacks. Where they'll do attack 1 and A will shoot, and then B will shoot, and then C will shoot, and then D will shoot, and so on, and they'll rotate the next attack, et cetera, et cetera. And in Lethal Tempo fight, every time you destroy one of those clock faces, the goal there is that each face is responsible for one of the boss's moves, but when destroyed, the remaining faces will use the moves that remain at a higher intensity. So the player has some choice of figuring out like which of the faces do I want to kill first? Do I want to get one of the faces out of the way really quickly because I have problems with a certain attack? Or do I want to sort of whittle them out all down equally so I kind of deal with just the base way of fighting the boss without having to deal with any of the ramp up because I can, get them all to one hit and then quickly finish off all of them. So we want all of our boss fights where possible to have this kind of agency and sort of unique approach to the way the player has to deal with the encounter. And I would say those are pretty big learnings for us versus 20XX, where we don't have really a lot of that and are accounted for.
Mm-hmm. And I guess with like having to like give the player like the different like designs or like making these boss fights a little bit more involved, how is that being, I guess, factored into kind of like, again, like a Mega Man's table, the rock, paper, scissors combat of having the right weapon that will, just completely counter the boss or just shut them down?
So we do have a weakness cycle in 20XX where A beats B beats C
Hmm.
beats blah 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 blah. But we don't have a this boss is a total joke with it. Our kind of attitude toward weakness cycle weapons in 20XX was let's make the weakness sort of help you circumvent one aspect of the fight. Either you can shortcut one phase, or you can mitigate one set of attacks with the boss weakness. Because total cheese in a game like this that we expect you to replay doesn't really feel very good. Like if
Hmm.
that's some of the Mega Man games have boss weapons that can literally one shot other bosses,
Yeah.
and that's not anything like we can really design for in a game like this and have it be any fun. In 30XX, we're still sort of having active talks about the weakness cycle. We're currently planning on not really bothering with it, so we're going to have lots of ways that the various weapons interact sort of on a one-off basis with boss mechanics, but not strictly as a cycle. And the reason why is that we really want to continue to support 30XX over a prolonged period of time. We see 1.0 as kind of we fulfilled kind of the obligations we set out to do when we built this game. This is the stuff we wanted to be part of the core product, but we'd love to continue adding content in the form of new stages, bosses, powers, new characters, tons of new items, stuff like that. Basically, just making more 30XX over a prolonged period of time. And the moment we start talking about adding new stages to the process, there's suddenly a question of, if we have a weakness cycle including 8 bosses, then we add boss number 9. What does that look like?
Hmm.
Is there a cycle with one missing entry? Do we have to reshuffle weaknesses around? And so we're not quite sure where that's going to land yet. But right now, we're sort of having a weakness directed graph as opposed to a weakness cycle.
Sounds good. And yeah, anything that you can do to kind of set that foundation for more supplemental content down the line seems like a smart move. I know with 20XX, you guys did release, I think, a few DLC characters. I think after the game was released.
Right. We made 2 DLC characters and sort of three pretty major content patches that added new skulls, a bunch of
Hmm.
new items to the game, sort of new ways for the player to sort of interact with the world.
Hmm.
This time around, we'd love to go much farther than that. I don't want to lock myself in here or anything, but like if the financials make sense, if the game is doing well for some time after 1.0, we want to be making content patches, kind of indefinitely. Obviously, every game stops at some point, but we'd like to go much further than we did with 20XX.
Are you thinking about doing a 40XX already, or is that still too early?
Oh no, way too early. The goal here is really that 30XX can be enough of a living game that we never really have a reason to make a sequel. I never want to say never. I don't really want to deal in those absolutes right off the bat because who knows what the future will bring. But we really would love to be able to continue to pour all of our creative output into 30XX for quite some time before we even start thinking about a sequel. If in fact the next thing we make is even the same kind of game.
Hmm. I know we are coming up on time in a few minutes, so I guess before we begin to wrap things up, anything else, I guess, design wise, that's different, comparing 30XX to 20XX that we haven't
Oh my
discussed
gosh.
on that you want to touch on?
Sure. So one of the big things that we haven't really touched on, I think I mentioned sort of tangentially earlier, that both characters in 30XX are able to sort of fully use the set of boss powers. So in 30XX, Ace and Nina control entirely distinctly. So in the first game, they have different primary weapons, but their boss powers are all kind of
Hmm.
identical. So they start off playing very differently, and then you get to the end of the run, and suddenly they're sort of homogenized a bit. They sort of play very similarly because they have the same toolkit available to them. In 30XX, not only do Ace and Nina have their entire own unique set of boss abilities, but they also have different resource systems. So Nina still has her energy meter that she's sort of using to she's sort of resource managing her energy with the power she needs to use for all of her very powerful boss abilities to get through a stage. And she can also combine boss powers together. She can use power A as a support for power B to produce a combo effect that does, kind of takes bits from both skills. So she kind of has, in addition to her 8 base powers, since she can combine them all together, she really has more like 64 powers in 30XX. So she has a lot of room for sort of player discovery and interaction with the various systems. Ace, on the other hand, sort of eschews the energy mechanic he had in 20XX for a quickly regenerating style meter, where he basically has the ability to use up to any two of his techniques in rapid succession, and they just come back over a pretty short period of time. So his individual uses of his moves are a little bit less impactful than Nina's because she's actually managing a resource to fuel her abilities. But instead, he gets to weave them in with the rest of his sort of natural kit, so all of it's kind of intended to flow together. And on top of that, for Ace, all of his abilities are actually mapped to the controller all at the same time. So some of his abilities are just a button press, but some of them are hold up or hold down in a button press. So the combo is what triggers the ability. So unlike 20XX, where he only has 3 buttons on the controller, 3 power buttons on the controller at the same time, here all of his techniques are available on the controller all at once. So he behaves very differently. That's definitely. I could go on about design changes pretty much all day, but I know we're coming up on end of time, so that's a big one we haven't discussed yet.
And I thought I remember reading that you guys are maybe doing something like an actual like roguelike mode where you can turn off persistent elements. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, let's go through this quickly. Just last week, we announced a new feature called Mega Mode, which basically removes permanent death and makes levels the same until you finish them. So in Mega Mode, we generate the entire campaign up front, all 8 levels. We generate them all before you even start playing the game. And then, as you sort of go through the levels, every time you die, instead of losing the whole run, you're just going to go back to HQ for an opportunity to start again. So you can try the same level again, maybe after buying a couple of power-ups to get a little stronger. You use your lessons to finish it up. Or you can try a different stage first. Maybe either finish that and get its boss power, or come back to the stage that after you finish it, you can come back to the stage that you died on, try that again. So you have a lot of flexibility of how to approach the run, and it removes permanent death, which we sort of intend both. There's a lot of people who love this kind of game, but just aren't super into permadeath games. And this mode is for them. And at the same time, the mode is also a wonderful first foray into 30XX for series newcomers.
Great. And again, there is still so much we can talk about, but I know we are just knocking on time. So,
absolutely right.
Very quickly then, for people listening. So right now, we are recording this during the PAX Onlne show. Is the demo for 30XX available for, I guess, public viewing now?
Yep. So as part of PAX Onlne, the demo is available through the 20th or so. It'll likely come back in a couple forms throughout the rest of fall as a couple more of these kinds of opportunities pop up. But play it now if you can. Other than that, if you want to hear more about 30XX, the best things you can do are wishlist or follow the game on Steam. You can search for 30XX, 30XX, or you can follow us on Twitter at Batterystaple_G, or join the Discord at discord.gg/20XX.
Great. And are you guys planning an early access period for 30XX in the future?
We are, yeah. Early access is likely to land sometime early next year. We don't know exactly when yet.
All right, great. So, like I said, Chris, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you today. There's still, again, we could spend a few hours here, but I know you have other appointments to get to. So,
yeah,
again,
absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Josh. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yeah, and thank you for taking the time out of the show for talking to me as well. So,
yeah.
With that said, everyone, we're going to wrap up our cast here. If you'd like to find out more about 30XX, there'll be links in the description down below. And if you are a developer working on an upcoming game and would like to come on and talk about it, we are always looking for new guests. Check out our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where it's in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.